Hello, friends of the paranormal. This is your co-host Stu, and I'm here with the paranormalist Patty Wilson. Patty, how are you today?
I'm doing wonderful. It is September and fall is coming. I can feel it in the air. So I'm pleased with that. I do love fall.
Yeah, me, I'm sad because I love summer. And so when summer's over, I get depressed.
Oh, I'm
And
sorry, Stu.
when winter comes, I get really depressed because that means it's a long time. And in Pennsylvania, we seem to have 6 months of winter, and then the other three seasons share the other 6 months. That just seems how it is. Because if you turn on the heat in your house, in my mind, that's winter.
Oh, well, then I've already entered winter because it was really cold this morning and I turned it on for an hour.
Oh my.
My
Well,
22-year-old Tomcat and I were chilly.
yeah, this is the time of year that yeah, I look forward to not running either air conditioning or heat.
Yeah.
So far that seems to be okay. So if you are just joining us, thank you for finding us. Please consider subscribing, clicking the like button that's down below. If you're returning, thank you for coming back. Just keep an eye on that subscribe button. Just make sure that the platforms don't turn it off for you. Down in the description, you'll find everything Paranormalist Podcast related. Our Facebook groups, which we have a couple of, Patty's blog. We have our email address where you can send us your ideas, your feedback, whatnot. If you'd just like to say hi to us, we'll be more than happy to get your email. And other than that, I think I'm trying to run through this as fast as possible because, again, I do it week after week after week. And with that, I think I've said everything. And now's where I say, what's our topic for today?
Oh, haunted houses with a twist.
Okay, I gotta say, I love haunted houses. I mean, you so many times you see those things like, "Oh, this house is haunted. Would you go into it?" Absolutely. But I'm interested in hearing the twist. So I will sit back and be entertained, just like our audience.
Yeah, most of these houses that are haunted today, you'll see there's a theme running through them as a general rule. I wanted to go out and look and see about some stories that were just really interesting and unusual houses. Not the same six houses. I don't know what it is about paranormal books and paranormal TV shows and stuff, but they tend to pick the same six houses in every state, and that's it. They never tell you any other story. And over the years, I've written 20 some books, and I chafe when I keep opening up anthologies and they're always the same six stories. I'm like, no, no, I don't want to hear about that house again, you know. So I wanted to do a little bit of something different. So I wanted to talk about some unusual homes. This home is unusual, and this story is unusual because the home was built by Frank Lloyd Wright, and it's
Oh.
called and for those who don't know, you might know him from his airplane fame, but he was actually an architect by
Mm-hmm.
trade, and he built some of the most beautiful homes in Pennsylvania. There's Falling Water, and there are dozens upon dozens of other homes throughout the country that he built that were equally as stunning as Falling Water. He had a knack for building homes that fit their environment. Like with Falling Water, he actually built the waterfalls that were in the area into the home.
Mm-hmm.
It's an amazing thing. So we're going to his work home, his private home, and that's called Taliesin. And Taliesin was more than just where he worked. It was, as I said, it was his home. To give you a little bit of background, he was a married man. He had 6 children, and he picked up a commission for doing a house for a client. And while he was doing this home for this client, he fell in love with the client's wife,
Oh, not a good thing.
and she with him. So they ran off to Europe, abandoning both families,
Oh, okay.
and she became his mistress. And he comes back. She divorces her husband. She takes custody of the 2 children. There's a boy 12 and a girl who's 8, and brings them with them to live. So he attempts to just divorce his wife, but she refuses. And this was not a no-fault divorce time. So if your spouse refused, you had to prove them unfit in some way. So there were a lot of really nasty divorces where somebody got dragged through the mud. And that was the height of the heyday of the, crooked-nosed private detective who would get the pictures and stuff. And the reason they did all that is because you had to prove infidelity or mental abuse or something that you could take to court to get that divorce to go through one way or the other. And she refused, and he couldn't come up with anything, or didn't attempt to, one of the two. So anyhow, he builds this home for him and his mistress because they aren't able to get married. And he builds it in the middle of the country. Her name was Martha. Everybody called her Mama Cheney. And as I said, they had 2 children, and they took up residence there. He had several servants and field hands, what have you, that took care of the property as well. He had a cook, a handyman, and they were separate from the field hands and the other workmen along the property, including the people who ran the barns and took care of the livestock and all of that as well. So this was a really big deal, upscale place. If you ever get a chance to see pictures of it, Taliesin was an absolutely gorgeous structure. And on the day of August 15, 1914, Frank Lloyd Wright and his one son, also Frank Lloyd Wright Jr., are in Chicago working on a project there to build a beautiful building. It's a big office space, I believe. Anyway, back at home, everything's kind of trucking along, just as it has always been. It's been years they've been living there now, and he has no reason to think anything's wrong. And his wife, his mistress, Mama, she's on the veranda with her 2 children, and they're being served lunch by the cook, who is her name is Gertrude. And her husband, Julian, is the handyman. They are from, I believe, Barbados. And they'd only been in the country a few months. He had hired them and brought them out, trained them, and what have you. He felt very confident everything was going to be okay. And on the inside of the house, there was a room that was kind of a lunchroom for the staff. And all the staff was there preparing to have lunch. They only know that Mama and the kids are on the veranda having lunch because somebody mentions it. They ate at a different time than the staff and, didn't rub elbows too much with them. So nobody's really paying much attention. To everybody's surprise, they hear what one man would later describe as a strange sloshing. And he looks up and he sees clear liquid, coming through the door under the doorstep frame. And he's puzzled, and he catches a whiff of gasoline.
Oh my.
And in seconds, the room erupts in flame, and he is literally half a step away from this gasoline. And when it blows up, it kind of engulfs him in flame, and he throws himself out the window and rolls down a hill, which fortunately for him puts the flames out. And the other staff in the room go running for the door, but it's locked from the outside.
Oh.
So a couple of them are beating on the door, trying to break it open. They do break it open, and they get through the door. 2 of them find the husband, the handyman, and he's standing there with a gas can, and he tries to flee, and they go after him, and they wrestle with him to try to get him down and subdue him. And he takes off, and they're burned from having to go through the flames to get out that door. So obviously they're not at their strongest. And they realize that that the house is going to go up in flames. There's no phone in the home, or at least no phone they can get to in the home. So they take off down the road a half a mile to the next estate, where they call for help. And to their absolute horror, as they run across the veranda, they realize that Mama and the kids have been hacked to death with an axe.
Oh, you did say a twist. Goodness.
I said there are twists. There are twists in most of these stories. Okay. So the gentleman who went through the window staggers up, covered in burns, and manages to get to the hose and turns the hose on. And he's trying to put the flames out. And as he's walking along, he catches a glimpse of the veranda and he sees the bodies as well. And they're just horrified. They don't know what to make of all of this. The only people who know who might have done it at this point are the two men who went for help. So they haven't said anything. And because they were just in a hurry to go find help. And they don't know what happened to this man's wife, who's the cook, and they have no clue what's going on. So they get back there, the fire trucks come, the police come, the bodies are, found. There's a guy by the name of Tom Bronker. He's the guy who goes through the window. They find him laying on the ground because the handyman snuck up and hit him with an axe. He's not dead, but he will die eventually from his wounds. Little boy who's 13, he was just kind of working this summer, like getting his first job, and he was killed with the axe. Another guy who was one of the servants there, named David Lindblom, also was struck and collapsed. He would die of his wounds eventually. Julian Carlton, on his way out, that's the handyman, he takes that other can of gas that he had in his hand whenever they saw him for the first time, dumps it on the bodies of Mama and the kids and set them on fire, and then disappears. And it would be later that night that Julian Carlton would be found in the furnace room, inside of the furnace itself. It was summer, it wasn't on. He had crawled in there to hide, and he had drank uric acid, and he would die 7 weeks later of starvation because he had eaten his esophagus up with the acid. He thought it would go quick, but obviously it did not. Now, hang on. I apologize. I can't help a yodeling cat.
I don't think any of our listeners mind.
I don't know why he does that. He does that every so often. Anyway, so anyhow, that's what poor Frank Lloyd Wright comes home to. Can you imagine getting that phone call and finding out that, most of his staff and his mistress he's lived with for several years and her children are dead, and Taliesin is in flames. So he buries his family, he buries them all. The father of the two children take them back to his family cemetery, and he buries his mistress. At that point, his wife is still his wife, and she finds out that he's writing letters to some woman who heard the story, made all the newspapers. This was big news. And some woman had written him, like thousands of people wrote to Frank Lloyd Wright and said to him, "Oh, we're so sorry, we send our condolences." And one of them was a young woman in her 20s whom he begins a correspondence with, which would become wife number 3. He has 5 wives in his entire lifetime. And so anyway, at that point, his first wife decides that nothing's ever going to make him come back to her. So she finally gives him a divorce, and he gets married. Now, as I said, there were several people badly injured, and they weren't able to take them into the house. Obviously, the house was on fire. So there was a cottage on the property, and the cottage was opened, and the injured people were taken there, where many of them succumbed, or that was their last spot where they were seen, and they would either died there or in the hospital very shortly thereafter. It was called Tanya Derry, was the name of the cottage that he had named it when he had built the property for her. And that is where the hauntings are. So he actually builds back Taliesin. He built it back exactly as it was the day she died, in honor of his mistress. And he keeps it exactly the same, the furniture, everything. I mean, he spends a lot of expense to do this, but he puts it back the way it was the last day she had been alive. And then he brings his new wife there.
Oh, my.
It's bizarre stuff. Like, there are things about him that are just really, really odd. I'm not saying he was a bad person or anything, but just odd. And it's at Tanya Derry where the hauntings are. So people have seen what they take to be Mama or Martha, her spirit coming down the path from the main house to Tanya Derry. And she's always in a flowing white nightgown of some sort. And that's what they always describe her, as a long white nightgown. She's not rushing, like she's in fear or anything like that, but she seems to be walking along headed in that way. She appears almost restless or lost or confused, if you will. There's stories that the doors and the windows will open and close by themselves within the cottage. Lights will turn off and on. Nobody's living there, and the doors and windows are locked, and they'll come down in the morning and find all the lights on and the windows and the doors hanging wide open. Nothing's ever disturbed, just that. And there have been voices heard, crying heard, people calling out for help inside of the cottage. And of course, everybody believes that this is from that particular event. So it's a house that's very haunted to this day. People have stories of it. And, people who've worked there, gardened there, been on the property at night have encountered these sounds and the haunting of Mama. And it is said that Frank Lloyd Wright had possibly encountered her himself, and if so, he was rattled, and but he never admitted it was her. He just said he saw a woman in white. It's a bizarre story. It's utterly bizarre, but it's fascinating.
Yeah, especially what would cause someone just to say that, all right, I'm going to cause some mayhem.
So I'm glad you brought that up, because
Okay.
I wanted to tell that part. I
Okay.
was curious about that myself, because I must have read a dozen articles, and all of them talk about this. Okay. And only in one of them did I find out that these people were recent immigrants and from Barbados, I believe. And that, all of this, they did find his wife Gertrude, and what she would tell them is that he murdered Mama and the kids. He came in the house, he told her she needed to leave right away, and she couldn't talk him out of what he had already done, obviously, and she couldn't talk him out of continuing the process. She was afraid for her own life, so she left. But she told the police that for weeks ahead of this, he had been growing slowly more paranoid and angry at the world. He kept saying people were out to get him. And then add to that the fact that he and she had been told by Mama that morning that they were going to be let go and given a severance pay and a ticket back to Chicago because they weren't meeting her needs, which was a fulfillment of his paranoia. It's an interesting story. And anyhow, yeah, they did eventually find his wife, and when she was found, she didn't come forward. And I'm sure that's because she didn't, she was afraid. She didn't know whether she would somehow be liable or anything like that. Well, when they found her, she told them everything she seemed to know. At least that was the story she told consistently. So we're going to move on to a new family. This family had a curse, or at least it seemed to have had a curse. Now, in St. Louis, there's a place called Lemp Mansion. And the Lemp family, well, they started out being very, very wealthy men. They made their fortune in the brewery business. Okay. And unfortunately, when Prohibition came and that fervor to, shut down all alcohol happened, it was unfortunate that there were victims, a lot of victims, whether you like it or not. That meant bars and restaurants had to close, and breweries lost their businesses, and wineries shut down. So a lot of people went bankrupt over this. And if anybody ever gets a chance to check into the Prohibition and that whole thing, it was a religious fervor that swept across this country and ate up an awful lot of nice people. The Lemps were among them. And so Mr. Lemp, he's struggling because of all of the things that are going on in the world. So at the time, and he's hearing rumors and stories, and his son, Mr. Lemp Sr., his name's William Lemp Sr., he finds out that his one son, his favorite child, shot himself in bed, and was a suicide. No reason has ever been given that I have found anyway. He was struggling mentally and emotionally, and that's the only thing I could ever find in print. So then the dad commits suicide himself. Now his other son, William Jr., known as Billy, was a good time guy. He checked out the chicks, and he had a child out of wedlock, and the boy had Down's syndrome. And he didn't abandon the child, but what they did would have been worse. They kept the child a secret, paid the mother off, and then raised him in the attic of the house where he was locked for his childhood.
Ah,
Okay. Now, as all this is going on, we're moving into like 1922, 1923, and they've lost their brewery. Mr. Lemp's daughter, Elsa, committed suicide, but not in the house, but elsewhere. And so Billy, knowing his son was locked upstairs and everything was going away and he was going to lose it all, shot himself in the same bedroom where his father had died.
tragedy
So that
after
leaves,
tragedy. Goodness.
it's this, there's
Yeah.
this family, like you can see why people think they're cursed.
Hmm.
Because like just thing after thing after thing happened. And then they don't tell you anything about the disposition of the boy, but there were servants and people who knew. So I'm assuming he was, removed from the house at some point. There's one son left. His name is Charles. And he lives in the mansion. I can't imagine living in the house where almost your entire family committed suicide. I can't, but he did. He lived in the house until 1949. And a servant went in to find him because he hadn't gotten up for breakfast. And on the bed was a note that said, St. Louis, Missouri, May 9th, 1949. In case I am found dead, blame it on no one but me, Charles Lemp. And he had shot himself. So the house had a huge amount of tragedy. And, that amount of tragedy kind of begets these kinds of stories. So the family actually does not end up selling the property. And they've lost everything through the prohibition, but the house ends up staying as their residence for a while until Charles commits suicide. And then after his death, it's sold. It's turned into a boarding house, not a very nice one, not well maintained. So it's kind of like a second class boarding house, if you would. It was a really difficult place for the people who owned the boarding house to keep tenants, mostly because people would claim that they heard phantom footsteps, that they heard knocking on their doors, that they heard gunshots, that they heard a child in the attic yelling, "Come play with me, please." And it just was not uncommon. So people would move in and then they would find another place to live and move out because they didn't want to live with all the paranormal stuff. So in 1975, a guy by the name of Dick Pointer bought the building and turned it into a restaurant and an inn. He completely redid it. It's amazing. I've seen the photographs from that time of the redo. It's amazing to see. And he said he knew it was haunted, but he wasn't afraid of that. And he said sometimes it was difficult to keep staff. They reported seeing apparitions of the Lemp family. They had odd sounds, gunshots, screaming, crying, the sound of the boy crying, asking for help, somebody to come play with him. And they also reported very much feeling watched. If you're in a room and you're laying out tables for dinner and you have that awful feeling you're not alone and you keep looking up and like there's nobody there, or sometimes there was, and that person faded away when you glanced up at them. He said that that many of the employees had the experience of having the piano play itself at the end of the night, as though somebody were sitting at the piano playing it, and it was not a player piano. Doors would lock and unlock themselves at will. All kinds of that kind of stuff went on. So the house has a really large reputation in St. Louis of being haunted. In fact, a lot of ghost hunting groups and stuff have gone by. They even had a group that they mention in one of the articles that actually caught a voice of a child from the attic crying out, "Come play with me." So like I said, that's why I started looking to see if I could find out more about the boy, but there's no more mention of the child after that. We're going to move on to a house in Ohio called the Franklin Castle. Now, this house is built by Hans Tiedemann in 1881. Hans was a German immigrant. He came here. He made a fortune in the grocery industry. He was every migrant's dream. He brought his wife and his 6 children, and they started with nothing, and he ends up making a ton of money. He works 20-hour days. Like he earned it. Everybody who knew him said he was and I've read articles where they quote from people who knew him at the time and had left like testimonials about who he was. Because not only was he a great businessman, but he was a man who wanted to provide not only for himself and his family, but for other immigrants coming in as well from Germany. So
Okay.
he builds this beautiful, elegant house with turrets and great big windows, and it has this like turn of the century charm. It's like something, it sounds very much like something from an old Russian novel. He wanted it to, express his
Hmm.
ethnic background. And he builds it 4 stories high
Okay.
because he wants to offer housing to other German immigrants coming in who that don't have anywhere to stay. So again, he's not a bad person from everything I can tell. He had the greatest of intentions. Unfortunately, it doesn't work out that way. It just didn't. So his 13-year-old daughter died of diabetes in the house. And then his mother dies shortly thereafter in the house. And throughout the time there, his wife dies next. He ends up burying 3 more of his 3 children, and like he's lost 4 children of 6, his mother and his wife in the house. He just doesn't know what to do. So he ends up leaving what he had called Franklin Mansion or Franklin Castle, which was this home. So he sells it to another person who, Mulhauser, who's a German, and he starts the German Socialist Society, which doesn't make people real happy. And then in the 1920s and 30s, Mulhausen, supposedly, they can't prove it, but supposedly he started an illegal liquor production building in there. And it is claimed, I can't find any documentation beyond just the articles about this part, that it was a nest of Nazi spies during the World War II.
Goodness. All right.
Well, I mean, German immigrants coming in, you could see how that could possibly happen. You could also see the other side of it being that the German people that were here, people don't talk about that much. We know what happened to the Japanese people. They were put in internment camps. What we don't talk about is that German families had their homes burned. They were ran out of towns. They were treated really bad. And, even if they had been here for many years and had settled into the community, they were suddenly suspicions that they were Nazi spies. So this is what happens there. So I don't honestly want to say that that's true because I can't document that in any way. There wasn't like there were arrests or anything like that. But you can see how the local people would be turning against the property at this point. First of all, they're possibly making illegal hooch, which some people would like and some people would have found really repellent at that point in time. And then they're Germans. They're speaking German. They must be Nazis. So the home gets a really bad reputation. Then a family by the name of the Romanos buy the property in 1960s and they move in. And that's when the paranormal stuff happens. So according to the Romano family at the time that they move out, they tell the whole story. The day they moved in, 2 of their children encountered a little girl crying on the 3rd floor. And when Mrs. Romano went up to the 3rd floor to check, wondering if like a child had broken in and gotten lost in this labyrinth of 4 floors, there's no child there. So she kind of brushed it off. And then there was an organ, a big pipe organ in the dining area, and it had been there for a long time. And it's not one of those things you can lightly move. They're hundreds of pounds and built into walls. And so they left it. The Romanos left it. It was atmosphere, if you will, except it started playing itself. You would hear heavy footsteps going to it, and then it would open and it would begin to play itself. Now, anybody that knows anything about these old pipe organs, there's all these different dials and not dials, but like pull tabs and what have you. You have to play to get the sound. You have to pump the organ with your foot and all of that. So it took some doing. It wasn't something you could accidentally do. It's not like a cat running across a piano keyboard.
Right. Right.
And after that, things got worse. 2 of the older Romano children woke up one night to find something had yanked the blankets off their bed. They pulled the blankets back, laid back down, thought that's just really odd. Like you're half asleep. So you know how you do that? Like you're like, I know that couldn't be, but you're kind of scared and your anxiety's heightened and you're like laying there holding onto the blanket and trying to tell yourself it must have just fallen off and you just imagined it. and all of a sudden the blanket gets ripped out from under them, over them again, right out of their hands. And that's when they took off screaming. One night, Mrs. Romano felt something yanking on her blankets. She wrapped her arm around the blanket to hold it tight. It pulled her off the bed.
Oh, okay.
While she's holding onto the blanket, and she smacks into the floor, starts screaming, and an unseen presence begins to scream beside her. She could hear it but not see it. Eventually, they went to their local priest. The priest went through the house. He was like, this house is really haunted, too much death, too much misery. Get out. So they finally did. In 1974, they sold the house. And when Mrs. Romano, local people knew about it, a reporter heard about it, the story gets into the news. The 60s was about the beginning of the time when people began to talk about the paranormal in public, if they, as much as possible. And so she admitted all of this in an article, and she said that she thought that the little girl that her children would encounter, that little girl in white that from the first day, and they saw her many other times, that it must have been Emma, which was Tideman's oldest daughter, the one who died of diabetes. Because remember, they wouldn't have known about the insulin and all of that at that time, so she just suffered and died of diabetes. So then the new owner comes in. His name is Sam Muscatello, and he heard about it and wanted to capitalize on its reputation. He thought it would be cool. And so he started letting people come in for a fee and like sleep there and check it out and what have you. And he admitted, after he sold it, he said, I have to tell you, I would tell funny stories and ghost stories and get people interested because they'd come in and check it out. But things did happen there. And then he told about his experiences, things brushing past him, things, footsteps going by him and there would be nobody there, doors closing in front of him or opening in front of him, just a lot of that kind of stuff, hearing a child crying, different things like that. Now, it got to the place where one of the radio shows in town, a Cleveland radio host by the name of John Webster, wanted to do a show there. And I don't know if anybody remembers that, but back in the 80s and the 90s, that was like all the rage. The radio channels would go do remotes, and we were live from Baker Mansion, which is one in our area. And there's a story about a guy who from a radio show who did a radio show in Baker Mansion and had an experience. So for this guy, John Webster, he was going to do a live from this castle, Franklin's Castle, and Halloween, and we'll see if it's haunted. So he's up there going up on the second floor when, as he says it, his recorder that he had brought with him was snatched from his hand and thrown down the stairs. And his quote is, "I just stood there holding the microphone, and as I watched the tape recorder go flying down to the bottom of the steps where it broke into pieces." After all of this stuff, after a while, people didn't want to go to Franklin's Castle so much anymore. It was old news. So then the house is sold again and again and again, and everybody who has it never keeps it for very long. There's odd vapors. This is interesting. Odd vapors that you walk through, like a mist, hearing a child crying, seeing a woman in black standing at the window, so they believe to be the first owner's wife after the daughter died. She was in black for mourning. And because remember, the daughter died, then the mother-in-law died, and so she would have been wearing black for quite a while. And then she dies. This is the third person in the history. So in the 70s and 80s, somebody got the idea of creating this evil persona for poor old Hans Tideman. So they said that he murdered his wife and his mother, and that he hung his daughter Emma and all this. So a man came along who wanted to disprove it, and I hope I say his name right. His name is William Krejci, Krejci. I hope I said it right. Krejci, maybe. And he's an author from Cleveland, Ohio, and he decided to write a book called Haunted Franklin Castle. And he went through all of this, and he said that he doesn't believe that any of the stories are true. There were never any insinuations anywhere in any of the documentation he found of any kind of impropriety from Mr. Tideman at all. He said he looked at medical records, he looked at autopsies, Nobody died of foul play, or at least as far as like the coroner was able to say this person died of diabetes, this person, died of a heart disease, this person died of whatever. So that story isn't true, and it is in a lot of the articles after the 70s, because the story was wild and it sounds entirely cool and menacing, but it's not true. So this is a tragic family who lived in the home. It for some reason it never brought them any happiness at all. It just brought them sadness, and it's just a really sad story. So our next story takes place in the 19th century, 1896 to be exact. 23-year-old girl by the name of Celia, or Celie, as her family called her, who was what they would have called a little slow in the time frame. So she was a very pretty girl. I've seen a photograph of her, and she was a very pretty young girl. And she fell in love with a neighbor boy who was 16 years old. Now, the 16-year-old boy was mortified. First of all, she was way older than him. Second of all, she was slow. And, 16 is not that age where you want to stand out. So it got to the point where she was stalking this kid. And she convinced herself that the only thing separating her from her beloved were her parents, because her parents intervened and said, Celie, you can't go over to that farm. You've got to leave that boy alone. They were trying to get her to stop because it was obviously distressing the other family. You can imagine if you go to the barn to milk the cow and there's a girl hopping up out of the haymow screaming, I can't wait for you to give me a kiss, or something. Like, it freaked this family out big time. So she gets this, I guess after one of a very stern talking, she gets the idea that if she could just do away with her parents, everything would be good.
Yeah, I had a feeling you were going that way.
Yeah. She could run off with her beloved and nobody would need to know that they were different ages and all of that. So she's in the barn and she sees a box of rat poison. Like, everybody had rat poison in their farms. They had it on a shelf in a barn or in a cabinet somewhere, and it just sat there. And she took a teaspoon of that and she put it into the cottage cheese that she had been sent out to the milk house to get, and stirred it up, and she fed it to her family. She didn't eat any cottage cheese that night, just her mom, her dad, and her little brother. And so her mom survives. Her dad and her brother die. Well, it's a poisoning death. So they look at her mom, but her mom ate it too. So then suspicion falls on Celie because she didn't eat any and she wasn't ill. There's an inquest afterward and they can't prove anything. So it's just, could it have been an accident? Is there some other mechanism? Did maybe the father stick it in there because he wanted to commit, murder-suicide? There were all these questions. So she goes through this whole thing, and her mother, amazingly enough, stands by her. She's not convinced Celie did it. And even if she did, she's slow, and all she has left is Celie. So she stands by her. Like they say at the inquest, Celie had carefully prepared answers, and she would look at her mom and she would say, you could tell she was quoting, and she would say an answer. I wasn't in the barn this evening, right? And her mom's like, that's right, Celie. Like, she was coached, major league. And so she would look at her mom for cues, and her mom would nod at her and, keep it up and that kind of stuff. So her mom takes her home and they start to life over again. Except she poisons her mom a second time.
Yeah, I was going to say, the whole purpose of doing it was to make the parents go away so she could see the 16-year-old boy. So
right.
If you have any survivors, we got to take care of that.
But nobody knows that part yet. Nobody does. So they just, everybody doesn't know that. And then mom gets sick a second time, and this time mom dies. So now we've ruled out the last party. The only other person it was going to be of suspicion that was still alive was mom. And now mom's dead. So people feel so bad for Celie, and a lot of people don't. She goes to the Pleasant Valley Lutheran Church, and every week she goes just like clockwork, no matter what. She knows there's people whispering, but she don't care. And one day she's talking to a friend of hers on the steps, and I don't know how they got around to it, but her friend finally said to her, Celie, just between you and me, did you have anything to do with all those deaths? And Seeley said, yes, I killed them all. Now I'm waiting for my beau to get things together so we can run off. Well, her beau was a 16-year-old boy who knew nothing about this. And, they actually looked into him to see if he might have had some, part in it, but he wasn't gathering up money. He didn't have a bundle of clothes. Nobody ever saw them together. Everybody in his family said, oh, that girl's crazy. And had been for years saying this at this point, like 3 years, this has been going on. And her friend goes to the police and says, she admitted it to me on the church steps. You need to get her off the streets before she kills someone else. She doesn't understand that what she did was wrong. So they arrest her. They try her. She admits it in court. Her mom's not there to coach her. Sure did. So wanted to run off with so-and-so. And they put her in the state hospital. She lived there until she was 61 years old. And now what was her home is now part of the Marabar Farm State Park. And, people talk about the area where her home had been, where they hear walking, they hear singing of a young woman. They have heard voices talk, a female voice talking, either in the house or the barn area. And it's believed that not only is Seeley there, but her family is there as well, that they never moved on. They hear a boy crying. They think that's her 8-year-old brother. Her mom trying to soothe him. You hear her voice, it's going to be okay. It's going to be okay. So it's just a very sad and creepy story. And they think that Seeley's there too, that they've heard her talk, they've heard her sing. Some people have seen a young woman walking towards the barn where the barn had been. And they've actually recorded the spirit of a woman on videotape. They have audio tape of a little boy crying, I'm scared, I'm scared. So it's an interesting story and just as bizarre as could be. So the next story I wanted to talk about is going to go back to the Frank Lloyd Wright family, but now Frank Lloyd Wright Jr.
Okay.
So Frank Lloyd Wright Jr. made his name by building homes in Hollywood in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. Okay. He had this really bizarre, it's beautiful, but bizarre style. So he built a home that was Mayan revival. I don't even know how to explain it to you. So yeah, I know. That's what he called it, Mayan revival. So basically, when you walk into this house, it looks like you're walking into a cave. Like there's this, it's an oblong, okay? But the front of it has this facade that looks like stone built up around it, and there's like an opening you climb through, which is go through. It's a doorway, and the stone kind of wraps up high, like a couple stories high. So it looks like you're going into a cave, okay? And it opens into these rooms that have what look like Mayan pillars that hold the fireplace up, and stained glass and Mayan depictions on the ceiling. And they're huge vault-like rooms with large chunky furniture. And in the center, there are no windows on the outside of this, none, except that front door. And in the center is a patio area. So you walk down a corridor, you come into the front, you walk down a corridor right or left, and it's all glass on the inside. So it's very bright. And then there's rooms, okay, where you can go down to the kitchen, to the dining room, to the bedrooms. And it's a very odd, like I've seen the architectural renderings while doing research on this story. And it's gorgeous. I won't lie to you, it's gorgeous. But this property it's just very unusual, big vault-like rooms. It's just insane to look at. It was built for a family by the name of, they only call them John and Ruth here. I apologize, but that's what they call them. And this is a home that was used by this family. They were well-to-do in Hollywood, rubbing elbows with the rich and the famous, Cecil B. DeMille, those kind of people were hanging with this family. It is a man and his wife and his 6-year-old daughter. They move in. They wanted what they described as a bohemian playhouse where they could throw parties for actresses and Hollywood types. And they had, and the family's last name was Soden. I knew I had it somewhere. I'd written it on the side. John Soden was the name of the guy who had the house built by Frank Lloyd Wright Jr. And they did. They had wild parties there and all kinds of craziness going on. And anybody who knows about what the parties of the 40s and 50s were like, the sex and the drugs and the, the orgies, the whole 9 yards, that was all going on all the time. And that was the kind of crap they were doing in this house. That's going to be important, and you'll understand why in a little bit. If you ever get a chance to look at any of the houses, you should really look at this one. This one is so unique. It has vaulted stairs going up to it, and it looks like you're opening a cave door. It's really insane.
It doesn't sound like something that I would even consider bidding on.
Well, I'm not saying you would buy it, but it does give you that Mayan feel.
Okay.
So anyway, the Sodens only lived there for about 3.5 years. Like I said, in 1930s, that was one of the houses he built. They lived there for 6 years, 3.5 years together, and then they divorce, and Mrs. Soden gets married to her second husband, David Barnett, and they stay until 1936 with her daughter. And then it's sold to a guy by the name of Milton Blazer, who rents it, and like so many different movie stars move in, and it becomes this really poshy place to like live. It's really avant-garde and all of this. Now, 1945, a guy by the name of Dr. George Hodel buys this house, and he moves his third wife, Dorothy, and their 3 sons, Michael, Kelly, and Steve, into the house. This is important. He's kind of an odd duck. Like, he started out being an artist, and then he was a writer, and then he couldn't make a living at any of these things, and then he eventually becomes a med student, and he ends up creating a school of he ends up going to school to be a surgeon, and he goes into the military for a little bit, and he takes weird jobs like being a surgeon at a lumber company in Arizona, and then comes back to California and marries another woman, and then he runs a clinic for venereal disease, and it's just like he's all over the map, just a very odd man, and he doesn't seem to ever be able to stay put. Like, he has like 5 or 6 wives throughout his lifetime. He has multiple sets of children with these different women, and he has totally different careers, but his medical practice was about a mile from a place called the Millennium Biltmore Hotel, and that's where he was working in 1947. That will become important, because you see, in January of 1947, a young lady, I believe some of you will actually know who I'm talking about, Elizabeth Short, who would become the Black Dahlia, as in the Black Dahlia murders, was staying at that hotel. And it is believed that she was making money by being a prostitute for young soldiers during World War II. It was a place where there was a lot of young soldiers. They were being furloughed from different military barracks. She was always seen in the company of a young soldier, but it was not the same one twice, if you get what I'm saying. And a lot of young ladies at that time frame were doing this to keep body and soul together. We were just coming out of the Great Depression, 10 years of starvation, and anything was better than starving. So living in a fine hotel and eating nice meals with people, nice looking men who give you money, was very appealing to a lot of the young ladies of that time frame. Now, Dr. Hodel's daughter in 1949 goes to the police. She's 14 years old. Her name is Tamar. And she tells the police her father's been sexually abusing her at the home, the Soden home, where he now lives. And they go to the house. They find what they call predatory photographs. They're very cautious because in that time frame, they don't want to release any information about a minor, and pornographic objects. In 49, he argues that This is bizarre. This is a quote from him. It's from an article in 1949 where he's talking about this case that's coming up. He hires a fine attorney, the whole 9 yards, and he says, the action which I am accused of participating in is unclear, and I am not sure if I was dreaming or if it was real, and if I was being hypnotized or hypnotizing someone else. Then he gets this really good attorney. I mean, that's just bizarre. And he says, these things must have happened in this article. And then the attorney tries to get everything taken out of the papers and pulled out of everything. And he's like, no. This is ridiculous. Now, remember, he pretty much confesses that something happened in that article. I mean, he's using some bizarre things, like maybe somebody hypnotized me and I maybe molest my daughter.
Jeez.
But then he says, but something happened. These things happened. So you would think he would get convicted, but This attorney by the name of Jerry Geisler, who was apparently like the best attorney in the country at that time, or at least in that area, he manages to get him acquitted in 1950. So during the case, a boarder he would have strangers come in and out of the house all the time and stuff. And one of the boarders who had paid rent to him was a guy named Joseph Barnett, who told Geiser, and it's in the notes from the attorney, that he never turned over. That Tamar said to him, the house has secret passageways. My father is the murderer of the Black Dahlia. My father is going to kill me and everyone in the house because he lusts after blood and he is insane. Now, he confides that to the guy's attorney and says, you need to do something. This guy needs locked up. He hides this and gets him off. However, because of the incest case, the police go in and they put bugs in the house. Okay. And they find all these incriminating statements on from him. They're literally having him surveyed 24/7. And there's 2 different police detectives working this case full time. They're now beginning to believe he was the Black Dahlia killer, because this little girl, according to Joseph Barnett, or at least Joseph Barrett, is saying that he has secondhand knowledge that he might have been the murderer of this woman. Okay. And it's known that he frequented prostitutes and he brought people to his home for illicit sex, even though his kids were still living there, although his wife had left. His kids would come and go. And this goes forward till his son becomes a police detective. His one son becomes a police detective and finds out through a documentary or an article that his dad's name is associated with the Black Dahlia murder. Like, he didn't know it. He was just a little boy when this all happened.
All right.
Okay. And like, it's not something that his family's ever going to talk about. And his sister Tamar and his father had this rift, supposedly because she accused him of molesting her. So nobody believed what Tamar was saying, although they're now grown-ups. Okay. And he's like, I don't know if my dad molested her, but this is crazy. What are you talking about? So he goes back as a police detective, pulls all the documents and wants to clear his dad's name. And he ends up writing a book saying, oh my God, I think my dad did it. He admitted it in so many ways to so many people at so many times while under surveillance. They have the audio tapes. And then the question became, why didn't he get arrested and put in prison? Because all they had was the audio tapes. And he was very well-to-do, and he was well-connected with a lot of really well-to-do people. They had already tried it once. And when he thought they were getting hot on him, he fled to Hawaii. So he left the country he was technically still in the country, but he left the continental United States, goes to Hawaii, creates another whole name for himself and a persona. And he lives there, marries a woman, abandons her, marries another woman. Again, he's not a stable soul in any way. And the house becomes vacant. His attorney takes it over. The speculation is that in lieu of paying the attorney, he gave him the house. Okay. And the attorney's secretary moves in, and her family, and then other families are renting it after she moves back out. Now, eventually a designer and a developer moves in, and their name is Zoran Balbis. I can't make that up. In 2001. And they hear the stories and, what have you. It's a beautiful home, like I said, in its own weird way, it is very pretty. I don't know that I would want to live in it, but it's very pretty. And so they begin to have weird experiences in the house. They hear a woman crying in the basement. They hear screaming. They have family come in who turn around and go, no, 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 there's something wrong with this place, really seriously wrong with this place. There's there is a person who sights a woman tied up in the basement, and they freak out and they go running upstairs and they tell them, and then they go back down and she's not there. So, and Hodell's daughter Tamar says that when she was in her late teens, still living in the house, because remember her father bailed eventually, and her mom had nowhere to live for a little while. So until the house gets transferred over to the attorney, they are in and out of the house off and on. She saw a woman in the basement. In 2016, Zach Bagans investigated the Sowden house, and he took with him Tamar's daughter, Fauna, thinking that maybe this will trigger something if Hodell's there. She goes down to the basement and she begins to scream. There's a woman in the basement. There's a woman in the basement. There's a woman in the basement. And backs out hysterical. It is now believed that by his son, Stephen, the one who's the police officer, that not only did he kill the Black Dahlia, but that he was a serial killer and he murdered other women in that house. He would bring them there either as dates or escorts and do away with them in the basement of the house. I don't know if there's any secret passages like Tamar said or any of that. Nothing's been found and made public, at least. But there is a good likelihood he is the number one suspect for who killed Elizabeth Short and possibly others, because there was a series of these, like everybody talks about the Black Dahlia murder like it's a singular event, but it's not a singular event. There was a series of these killings in that area at the time Hodell lived there, and all the other ones got swept under the rug. Elizabeth Short was probably the first one, or at least the first one that was publicly known, and she made the newspapers and all of that, and her family made a lot of noise. And to be honest with you, even today, hookers and sex workers, when they disappear, nobody makes much noise as a general rule. And that's why serial killers, one of the reasons they're easily accessed, and they're on the margins of society, probably on the outs with their families, often addicted to something, and they're easy prey. And if he was a serial killer, I could see that would be where he would go, because he also had a predilection for sex with a lot of different women. So this house is extremely haunted. And the owners have said that for years. Now I'm going to end here, and we're going to do a part 2 next time.
Okay.
And just to get you to tune in for the next section, among the things we're going to talk about is a Japanese demon called Akasha, which means fire cart, or they're a demon that comes out of hell in a wave of fire. And in 1942, there was a rash of this happening at a house in Hawaii, in Honolulu, Hawaii. And wait till you hear what the police have to say.
Okay.
With that, I will leave it go. So for everybody, I wish you sweet dreams after all of that, and good night.